Thank you, Emma. Well, by now you should be at Ruth chapter 4, right? Ruth chapter 4. It's one thing to have talent. It's another thing to use it for the honor and glory of God. Thank you for doing that. Ruth chapter 4. We started in the book of Ruth several Sunday mornings ago when it's been interrupted by a couple of things that we've done on Sunday morning, but we find ourselves in the final chapter of this book this morning. And the book of Ruth shares, among other things, the tragedy that Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi experienced. The tragedy is that disastrous event that kind of leaves you marked by the loss. It leaves behind it a disturbed state of suffering, sometimes deep distress. It sometimes scars us for the rest of our existence in life. And the truth is that no one is immune to tragedy. No human being. Sometimes when tragedy comes our way, we think, well, why me and not somebody else? But understand, somebody else will have their turn. There's tragedy, there's no one that has any immunity to it. It's something that strikes all of us equally. In fact, Job addressed that as he was going through his dark, distressed time of just painful tragedy by commenting that man that is born of woman is a few days and full of troubles. And that's his way of saying all of us. Because we're all born of woman. That's what we all came to the world. And so Job was a man who had been to the top of the world, but he identified with everybody who came into the world. Says tragedy is just a part of this human experience. And I do not know how everyone else responds to tragedy. I don't know what your reaction is when you get that phone call, you get the knock on the door, you get the message, the news that you didn't want to get. I don't know what your response is. I do know mine. And my knee-jerk reaction, my immediate response to tragedy is to say, God, why? I want to question God. I want to ask God questions like, how could you do this? How could you let this happen? Why would you let this happen? Just why does this have to be my experience? And those are the kinds of questions that litter my mind in the immediate aftermath of tragedy. And I understand that they are questions that are unlikely to be answered in this lifetime. I get that. And for me, the book of Ruth brings these questions to the surface. Because the book of Ruth invites us to enter into the tragedy that a woman by the name of Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth experienced. The book bears the name of the daughter-in-law, but understand, she's not the only one going through the tragedy. She's just one of the ones that is experiencing it. Her mother-in-law Naomi is right there beside her. There are two women that lived in ancient time, and they have experienced great loss. For Naomi, she's lost her husband, and she's lost her only two sons, her only two children. They both have been lost. For Ruth, she is a young woman that has lost her husband. One of those sons was her husband. And in the aftermath of that tragedy, they find themselves in an almost even more tragic position. I mean, first of all, Naomi's not at home. She has been relocated. Her and her husband have decided to leave the promised land, the Jewish promised land behind, and go somewhere else where we may say they shouldn't have gone. In fact, we could say that God had commanded the Jewish people not to return to that place, and that's where they've gone. And so she now finds herself, she wakes up one day, and her husband's gone, her two sons are gone. We know the time period. We know that it's 10 years, about 10 years, from the time they leave home and go to Moab to the time they come back. We don't know the timeline of exactly when all the tragedies took place. We don't know. We don't know just how fast or how sudden or how slow it was between the loss of her husband and then the loss of her sons. Did it all happen at one time? Was it strung out over time? Those are questions we don't know. But we know there came a day when she woke up and she had to realize, I'm not home. I'm a long way from home. I don't have a home where I'm at. This is not where I belong. These are not my people. This is not where I fit in. There's nobody to take care of me. There's no one to help me make it through life. I no longer have a husband. I no longer have my children. I'm displaced. I'm totally at a sort here. And on top of that, I now have two daughter-in-laws that are looking to me to try for us to survive, and I can't even help myself survive, much less help them survive. And that's where she found herself. And the book of Ruth invites us into that tragedy. And for me, just for me, it's easy for me to get so caught up in the tragedy of Ruth and Naomi and their heartache that the cloud of their sorrows tends to obscure my vision of God's presence, of His light. In fact, if I'm not careful, the clouds of their despair kind of absorb and suck the warmth of God's love out of the room and leave me feeling kind of cold and empty and almost sharing in their tragedy, though thousands of years removed. And then I have to be reminded, the book of Ruth is not a book that's about tragedy. Oh, there's tragedy here. It's recorded here. We're given the story. But the book of Ruth is not about human tragedy. It's about the goodness of God. It's not about people that are suffering, although there are people suffering in the book. It's about God who enters into the experience of those that are suffering, that comes alongside those that are hurting, who makes a way when humans say there is no way. A God that comes into the scene and turns a time of desperate tragedy all the way around. In fact, there's a little quip, and if we were going to read a text this morning, we'd read an entire chapter. We're not going to do that. You rest easy. We're not going to read the whole chapter. But buried in that chapter, there's just a little phrase. If you're familiar with the chapter, Boaz and Ruth are going to become husband and wife. And as the old bachelor, old maid, Boaz finally gets a wife, Ruth, and the community joins in the rejoicing and the celebration of this couple. He's not young, she is, and they say something. They begin to bless them, and in blessing them, they say to Boaz, may you be as fruitful as Tamar was when she gave birth to Pharez. And if you're like me, you just kind of want to read past that and keep going, but it's something to throw the brakes on. I don't know if you're familiar with Tamar or with her twin sons, one of them Pharez. But let me just set the stage because it defines the chapter. You see, Tamar married a son of Judah, the namesake of the tribe of Judah. Only he died before she had a child. And so in keeping with the custom that's played out in the scene before us in the book of Ruth, Judah gives his next son to her as a husband, and he is to raise up children in the name of his deceased brother, but he'll have no part of it. And he acts in disobedience to the commands of God, and so he dies, and she's waiting for the third son. But Judah says, wait a minute, this woman's already had two of my sons, and they're dead. I'm not giving her the next one. I'm just not going to do it. And so he violates the culture norm, the tradition that they had, the commandments of God. And he says, I'm not going to give her my next son. I don't want him dying as well. And so he just kind of forgets it. She's back home at her dad's house. She's waiting for that son. And eventually she realizes he's not going to do it. He's not going to fulfill his obligation as father-in-law, and I'm going to die as a lonely widow without any children, and I'm not going to have any place in this world, and she won't have it. And she does something that, man, every time I read it, I say, did that really happen? It really happened. She takes on the attire of a prostitute. She positions herself on the pathway of her father-in-law. Apparently, she knew where he would go looking for a prostitute, which opens the door I don't want to walk down. And she waits. And lo and behold, he comes by. He doesn't recognize her. She's totally veiled. He hires her for the evening. She gets pregnant. She goes back home. And after a while, she can't hide the pregnancy. She is, after all, pregnant with twins. The news comes to her father-in-law. Your daughter-in-law has played the harlot, and she's pregnant. He says, let's stone her. Hypocritical at the least. But she has evidence that he's the father. She gives birth to two sons. One of them is Pharez. And when the women in the community of that day and age say to Boaz,
May Ruth be just as fruitful, and may she raise you up a tribe just like Pharez did, who was born of Tamar to Judah. They point their finger back to an ancient tragedy, and they say, from the sin and tragedy of a human failed experience, God smiled, and God blessed, and God brought good out of bad, and God brought blessing out of tragedy. And they look at Boaz and they look at Ruth and they say, may God do that for you. May God take your tragedy and turn it around into a blessing. May God take this moment in life where you feel you're at the lowest of lows, and may He turn it around and smile on it from heaven and just make it a wonderful experience. I read it, and I can't conceive any other reason why the women of the community would bring something from the sordid past into the very beginnings of their marriage relationship, except to say God has a way of taking our tragedy and doing something big with it. God has a way of taking our lowest moments and making them highlight reels. God has a way of bringing blessings out of our failures, even out of our sins, and it gives definition to the chapter because we have questions. And we have questions like why and how, and God, why would you, or how could you, and God may be in heaven saying, I didn't do it. Wasn't me. You want to ask God, why did I do it? God didn't do it. Yeah, God, how could you? And God would say, I didn't, but let me show you what I will do. I didn't bring your tragedy, but I can bless your tragedy. I didn't bring your hardship, but I can turn your hardship around. I didn't take you to the lowest point in life, but God is able to take us in the lowest point in life and bring something good from it. In fact, I want you to notice, I need to acknowledge that in the lowest points of my life, God is still very good. In fact, the book of Ruth, I am convinced exists, so that you and I can know that when you've come to that lowest point in your human experience, that God is still very good. That God has not created your tragedy, but He's good even in the midst of your tragedy. That God has not broken your heart, but God will be kind to you even in the midst while you're experiencing that broken heart. We can see the goodness of God even in a time of tragedy. Let me share with you a few reasons why. First of all, there's this. God is present. He's present. Where is God when bad things happen? Where is God when your heart is broken? Where is God when you suffer some terrible loss in your life that scars you for the rest of your life? Where is God when the bottom just drops out from beneath you and you feel as if you're free falling through life and there is no hope nor is there any help? Well, when you have that feeling, where is God? Well, the truth is, God is in the same place when bad things happen as He is when good things happen. God's in the same place. God hasn't moved. He hasn't relocated. He hasn't abandoned us. He hasn't forsaken us. God is present. Even in times of tragedy, God is present. When you look at the book of Ruth, and we've taken our time, we've walked through the book, we've noticed their tragedy and their experience, and we've seen the hand of God. Here they are. They leave Moab and they come back to Bethlehem, and Ruth accompanies Naomi back to Naomi's hometown. And when they get there, lo and behold, we find it's the time of grain harvest. And listen, don't just pass over that, because remember the tradition and the law that God had given His people during the grain harvest. Don't reap everything, don't gather everything, leave some stuff behind so folks who don't have can get something. That's Ruth, that's Naomi. That's them. They've come back home just at the time where they can be provided for, where they can get something to eat. And on the other hand, we see God's hand in the tragedy in the relationship that exists between Ruth and Naomi. I mean, Naomi has told both her daughter-in-laws, go back to your dad's house. I can't help you. I can't provide for you. I know we're family. I know you married my sons and you're my daughters-in-law, but you need to go back home because I am helpless to do for you what you need to have done. One daughter-in-law, she does. Ruth says, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to let you leave me. Where you go, I'm going to go. Your people be my people. Your God is going to be my God. Where you die, that's where I'm going to die too. I am committed to you, Naomi. On one hand, Naomi may have said, how am I going to take care of Ruth? On the other hand, Naomi had to say, thank God I'm not alone because of Ruth. I am convinced that when I go through a hard time in life, it is easier for you to see the hand of God in my life than it is for me to see the hand of God in my life. I mean, when I'm the one going through the bad time, it's almost as if I'm blinded to God's hand. I can't see it. Other folks will say, Brother Charlie, isn't God good? And I want to say, well, I know He is. I just don't always feel He is right. You know, I know that's who He is, but I don't always feel it. I don't always feel like I'm experiencing. Well, when we look at Ruth and Naomi's, and we see the hand of God providing for them. We see the hand of God and Boaz entering into this relationship with Ruth, and how they meet, and how he's interested, and how he moves to take care. And then there's the cousin of Boaz, whose name we never find in the account. He's actually closer related, and has first right of refusal, if you will. And he graciously steps out of the way so that Boaz can pursue his love interest, Ruth, and you see the hand of God. But I wonder if while Naomi and Ruth were living the tragedy, if they saw the hand of God, or if they were just as blind to God's hand as we are when we go through our bad times. I mean, it's easy for us to read the pages of a story that's thousands of years old and say, I can see the hand of God. Hey, the hand of God fed them. The hand of God protected them. The hand of God provided relationships. The hand of God even made Ruth and Naomi part of the family tree of Jesus Christ Himself. And it's easy for us to see it. But I don't think they saw it. They were like us. It's a whole lot easier for us to see the hand of God in their tragedy than it was for them to see the hand of God in their tragedy. Just like it's harder for us to see God's hand in our life when we're going through a bad time. Oh, see, I can see Him in your life, but I don't always see Him in mine. And yet, He's there. He's present. Where's God when life turns sour? He's the same place as He was when life was sweet. He's present. In the Old Testament lives a promise that was rendered to the Jewish people. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee was the promise God gave them. Unless we think it only belongs to Old Testament Hebrews, the New Testament writer of Hebrews drags that promise across the landscape of time and plants it in the New Testament so that every believer can know that promise is for us. That God has promised us that He would never leave us nor forsake us. So where's God when we're going through tragedy? Where's God when the bottom of life is dropped out? Where's God when you feel a loss and an emptiness on the inside, and you literally don't know what you're going to do, and you feel as lonely as you can feel? Where's God? He's right there. He's present. He's with us in our time of heartbreak and tragedy. He hasn't left us. He hasn't abandoned us. He hasn't turned and walked away from us. He has not deserted us. God is present even when we go through tragedy. Something else that we find. We see the protection of God even while they were experiencing the tragedy. Verse 9 says something in chapter 4. Boaz says to all the elders, he's gone to the gate of the city. That's where they did business. In the larger ancient cities, right off the gate, there would be rooms, sometimes on both sides of the city gate. In fact, one of the most ancient city walls and gates in the world is found in northern Israel. It dates back to the days of Abraham. And when it was uncovered, they immediately built something over it to protect it from the sun because it began to deteriorate almost immediately. It's up where the tribe of Dan would have been in the days of when they came into the promised land in the north. And there in that ancient city wall, there were rooms on both sides. You went through the gate. There's a room. It was on both sides, and it was there that legal business, would be conducted. That's where Boaz goes. Boaz goes to the city gate. He goes there to where those rooms are. And he starts waiting. Men start coming. Respected men, witnesses start following. He says, "Hey, well, you got a few moments. I'm going to need you in a minute." And men that were respected men in the community, they were called to the side by Boaz, and finally his cousin comes to his cousin that is closer kin to Ruth than he is, and he says our sister Naomi has come back from Moab, and she has a parcel of land that she needs to sell. It's Elimelech's land. You have the right of first refusal. Would you like to buy the land? Says this to his cousin. And his cousin, whose name we never know, says, "Yeah, I wouldn't mind buying that land." He said, "Oh, but if you buy the land, you've got to take Ruth as a wife and raise up children to the dead." And he said, "Oh, let me throw the brakes here. And can I tell you, I'm convinced that he's not the least bit adverse to that. He just knows that that puts him in Boaz's way. He's got a cousin who doesn't have a wife, who's getting on up in age. And so he graciously steps off to the side in a way that doesn't smear him in the community. And Boaz gets those witnesses that he's held and says, y'all all are witnesses that I'm going to buy my cousin's property. And when I buy my cousin's property, I'm also buying Ruth to be my wife. And I can almost hear the brain lock in every woman's mind here. Wait a minute. He bought her? Different times, different place, different tradition. And in a way, he did. Who made that happen? Who is it that led Ruth's steps to Boaz's field when she first went out together? Who is it that caused the widow who had no one to take care of her to cross paths with the unwed older gentleman who was looking for love along the way? I mean, who is it that reached down to planet Earth and caused these two to meet? And in a world that really did not know romance, it was a world of arranged marriages. Romance began to blossom. And who is it? And I hope you get to see that Naomi and Ruth have thrown themselves out into the hands of God. God had said that we're to be provided for. We are poor. We don't have a place. And God has said that folks are supposed to help take care of us. And we should be able to go out in a field and gather grain. And then we should be able to find something to eat. And we're going to trust that God will do that. And you may say, but what if society shuns them? Well, what if folks don't allow them in their fields to glean after the reapers? What if no one takes any pity on them? I mean, what they've done, if they just trusted God, and He said, this is what God said folks like us are to do, and that's what we're going to do. We're just going to trust God. And I've got questions about what if, and what if this had happened, or what if that had happened? Legitimate questions that we cannot answer because it didn't happen. They threw themselves out on the promises of God, and God held them up. God was good to them. God provided for them, and God protected them along the way. I do not know why they experienced their loss. I don't know why they had to go through the tragedy of losing their loved ones in the morning that followed that. I don't know why they became destitute and part of the member of those in poverty that cast in their society. I can't answer those questions. What I can tell you is that God was good to them in their tragedy. God was good to them in their poverty. God provided for them in their need because that's who God is. So I don't know why tragedy comes. I can't answer the question. But I can tell you this. When tragedy comes, God's good. He's good. Even when I can't see His hand, He's good. The daily grind of survival had them in its press, but God had them in His hand. Third thing I want you to notice, we see the goodness of God, not just in the presence of God or the protection of God, but in the presence of God. Not presence as if He's here, but the presence is what He gives. His gifts, His goodness. We started there. Verse 18 says this. Now these are the generations of Pharez. Remember Pharez? Pharez, the child of an illicit relationship. Pharez, his mother dresses up as a prostitute. His father hires Pharez, the offspring of that union. Now these are the generations of Pharez. Pharez beget Hezron. Hezron beget Ram. Ram beget Aminadab. Aminadab beget Nahshon. Nahshon beget Salmon. Salmon beget Boaz. Boaz beget Obed. Obed beget Jesse. Jesse beget David. And if we were to continue with the lineage, we'd find ourselves in the book of Matthew as Mary gives birth to Jesus. God's good. He's good. See, here's Obed. Obed doesn't have anybody to love him. And I get so fixated on Ruth's tragedy that I miss what Obed gets out of the deal. He gets a wife. He gets a child. He who had no child gets a child. He who didn't have a son to hand his stuff down to gets a son to hand his stuff to live for, to work for, to help. Boaz is obedient to God. God had embedded in his law for those ancient Jewish people exactly how a widow, especially a childless widow, was to be treated, and Boaz does that. Boaz steps out in obedience to God, and so often we associate sacrifice with obedience. So often when we think about obeying God, it's as if we've been programmed or conditioned. What is it going to cost me? I mean, what am I going to do if I'm obedient to God? What is it going to cost me? If I do what God said, what am I not going to be able to do? I mean, just exactly what am I going to have to sacrifice if I am obedient to God? If I tithe, then what am I going to miss out on? If I'm at church and I worship God, then what am I not going to be able to do? Hey, if I live for God, what's going to change? I mean, we think about what it's going to cost us and what we won't be able to do if we're obedient. Perhaps we need to think that obedience to God is not something that gets in the way of our dreams, but obedience to God is what furthers the best of dreams that God has for us. I mean, Boaz could have said, if I step out here and if I take on Ruth, then I'm taking on these holiness and responsibilities that I've never had before. And I'm going to have to take care of a wife, and that's going to cost me. My life is going to change because now I'm going to have someone else to take care of. And if I have a son with her, he's not even going to bear my name. He's going to bear the name of her deceased husband. I'm raising up children to the dead. I mean, he thought of all these things it was going to cost him. Here's what's interesting. Boaz has signed on to raise children that will not bear his name. And yet, the funny thing is, they do. When you read the genealogy, Mahlon or Chilion, they're not even mentioned. Elimelech doesn't come. I mean, Ruth's deceased husband, his name's not in the list. It's Boaz. What does Boaz get out of the deal? He gets love. He gets a companion for life. He gets a son who has a son who has a son who has a son. King David shows up. Solomon shows up. Jesus shows up. Let me ask you, what did being obedient to God cost Boaz? Well, not nearly as much as he got out of it. God was good. Listen, I don't know why tragedy comes. I don't know why some days it feels like the very bottom gets pulled out from beneath us. I don't know. And I've got questions you've got. Questions that aren't likely to be answered in this lifetime. I want sometimes to ask God, God, how could you? God, why would you? But don't let me get so caught up in the tragedy that I miss the goodness of God. When tragedy comes, God doesn't run away. He doesn't desert us. He doesn't abandon us. He stays right there with us. When tragedy comes, and it does, God still provides for us and protects us. When tragedy comes, God even smiles and proves that He's able to take something terrible and bring something good, just like He did with Pharez, just like He did with Boaz and Ruth, and just as He is capable of doing in our own lives. He can take our mistakes, our errors, our sins, and our failures, and when we bring them to Him in obedience, He's able to take the worst from our life and bring the best of heaven into our world. Would you stand for a moment? I'd ask you to bow your head. We started where I intended to stop. The account of Pharez, Tamar, in Judah, and that illicit relationship. But God took that terrible experience, that dark part of those humans' life, and made something grand from it. He's the same God who reigns in heaven today. He's the same God who sits on heaven's throne and even reigns in earth. He's the God who's able to take the very worst from our life and bring something good from it. If we will bring it and put it in His hands. If we will bring it in obedience and just bring it to God. It may be that there's some part of our life that God has spoken to, and we don't have to ask God, what would you want me to do? We know what God wants us to do. The issue is, will we be obedient? Will we throw ourselves into God's hands and trust Him? That if we obey Him, that He will live up to His end of the deal. Are we willing to say, God, I can't feel you, I can't see you, I don't know where you are, but I know you promised that you're right here, so I'm willing to trust you. Would we say, God, sometimes I don't feel it. Sometimes I just don't feel much like a Christian. But you're the God who's invited me to follow you, whether I feel it or not. And so I'm just going to obey you and trust you to bring the feeling. I trust you to take the tragedy, the painful, the dark experiences of my life and bring something good out of them. Trust you to be God. Father, I pray that in this time of invitation, if your Spirit so deals with our heart to make a decision, maybe a decision about where we're at in life, who we're living for, how we're living. Lord, I pray that as your Spirit speaks to us and guides us about making decisions to be obedient to you and trust you and to throw ourselves into your hands, I pray, Lord, you'd help us make those decisions, to say yes to you, to have faith in you. And we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. What are we going to sing? Page 3.